If you're determined to be in the sailing game, you have to do this race.
This race is demanding, physically and mentally. It is the ultimate yacht race.
The feeling of being with 11 other people who you love and who you trust your life with, there's just nothing like it.
You'll be probably frightened at times, scared, worried. You'll hate it. You'll absolutely despise the fact that you're involved. And when you get to the finish, you'll know why, because there's nothing like it.
For nearly 40 years, it has been at the pinnacle of offshore sailing. In October 2011, teams from across the globe will line up for this epic adventure. "39,000 miles around the world, across 4 oceans and to every continent on Earth. 11 crew members squeezed onto a state-of-the-art 70-foot racing machine with one single aim: to lap the planet as fast as possible. Racing up to 600 miles per day through searing heat and sub-zero temperatures, braving storm-force winds and waves the size of office blocks. Adventurers and athletes in equal measure, with the planet as their racetrack. Before the advent of air travel, the sea was the fastest way to move people and products around the world. In the 19th century, clipper ships, huge streamlined vessels, sailed eastwards around the globe with the prevailing winds, setting distance and speed records that would last for over 150 years. The clippers strove to go as fast as they could across the seas as a matter of professional pride. But it was a group of solo sailors, some 100 years later, that would provide the inspiration for man to race around the planet. In May 1967, Francis Chichester became the fastest man to sail around the world single-handed, stopping in Sydney on the way.
I felt there was the one big thing left in sailing, to go around the world non-stop. Chichester had stopped once and left us with just that to do. In life, you can say, no, well, there's other important things, or you say, I'm going to go and try it.
Well, Robin Knox Johnson set the scene, really. He proved it could be done non-stop. So it did the sport a huge amount of good, and it got people thinking, could we race yachts around the world?
Day 312, about 25 past 3 on April the 22nd, and Robin Knox Johnson and Sue Haley have sailed non-stop around the world.
The story I've always heard, which may or may not be true, is that it was cooked up in a pub in Portsmouth by the head of Whitbread, a Rear Admiral of the Royal Navy Sailing Association, and they had the idea. Who knows if that's true or not.
The Whitbread didn't start as the legend would have created it. The first mention of it came in a brochure presented by Anthony Churchill and Guy Pearce at Cowes Week in 1971, where they were toting the idea of a fully crewed race around the world.
There was a lot of interest, but they couldn't find the sponsorship, and it was the Royal Naval Sailing Association who were looking for something adventurous to do as well. And they brought in Whitbread. They had sponsored Chichester before.
News of the race spread, and soon hundreds of potential entrants from across the world were staking their claim. Aside from a few full-time sailors, it was a mix of former military personnel and affluent amateurs who were paying their way around the world. The foundations of the first Whitbread were built more on enthusiasm than offshore experience.
Well, they weren't out-and-out racers like we have now. They were all adventurers, and they wanted to go and see the world, and this was a great opportunity to do that.
We're going to sail normal boats around with normal people, all right, we're going to stop, but we're going to race. Was really an enormously challenging prospect, and I think that now it's hard to get our heads around quite how much of an adventure that was going to be for everyone.
The race would follow the traditional clipper route, heading south from Portsmouth, first to Cape Town, and then continuing eastwards with the prevailing winds to Sydney. Leaving Australia, the fleet would head down into the Southern Ocean to round Cape Horn and make for Rio de Janeiro, before the final leg back to Portsmouth. 27,000 miles around the world. On September 8th, 1973, 17 yachts left on the first Whitbread round-the-world race. From France's Eric Taballet on Penduic 6 to the Mexican millionaire Ramon Carlin on Sayula 2, none had sailed around the world before. All except one man, Che Blythe, the skipper of Great Britain 2.
Che was one of 9 children from a railway worker in Hoy in Scotland, and quite literally, as far as the yachting establishment was concerned, he was very much on the wrong side of the tracks.
He was determined. After all, he had rowed across the Atlantic, he had sailed solo around the world against the prevailing winds and currents, and it doesn't come more difficult than that, perhaps.
Well, Che Blythe was a sergeant in the paratroop regiment. Very tough individual. Never wanted to be an officer because he knew that the wars were won by the sergeants, not by the men above them.
The thing about the first Whitbread was, of course, that we were all sort of shooting in the dark. We weren't all quite sure what we're doing. My first problem was how to get a crew. And so I said, would it be possible to take Perils as crew? I worked on the principle that if I could train, then surely they could train. We went up to Scotland, a cottage I used to own up in the borders, and we spent about 3 weeks there doing some training. One of the things I did up there was to get a young lady professor from Glasgow University to give us psychometric tests. And the only person who had the key to this was me, so I could know what sort of chap I was dealing with. And it was quite amusing because on my one, it says something like not suitable for long distance sailing.
For the crews of that first race, life was very different to the high-tech world of a modern racing yacht. They navigated by sextant, and aside from a weekly call to the race office, they might as well have dropped off the face of the earth. As they headed south into the most isolated waters on the planet, few had any idea what they would face.
We were in very heavy seas, full gale 1, and in very cold area. I mean, we had icebergs and we were slipping along at some serious speed. And suddenly the cry went up, man overboard.
They did their planned plot searches of the area. They went back, they found the Dan buoy that had been thrown over immediately. Bernie had gone over the side, but they couldn't find Bernie.
It was just a nightmare, really. We searched for 4 hours, but he'd have been dead within 20 minutes with the cold alone.
Bernie Hosking was the 3rd fatality on that first Whitbread race. Blythe's team of paras had all seen active service and regarded the loss of a crewman as a tragic but immutable consequence of pursuing a life away from the safety of home. Stealing themselves through the Southern Ocean, they rounded Cape Horn in first place and were the first boat home in Rio.
And when we got into Rio, we had a memorial service for them, which was all the boats attended, which was very good of them. And I flew back to Britain to meet the parents because they would want to know exactly what happened and a first-hand account. That is not easy, you know. And they were real stalwarts, absolutely solid as rocks. You know, we explained to them, and there they were, their son dead, and yet they were, you know, taking it right on the chin. Really lovely couple. Yeah, it was great. Very sad.
The fleet left Rio on the last leg back to Portsmouth. Blythe's GBR2 was the fastest boat around the world, winning 3 of the 4 stages and crossing the line first into Portsmouth after a then world record of 144 days to circumnavigate the globe. But it was Ramon Carlin's Sayula II who took the win on handicap and would go down in history as the first winner of the Whitbread Round the World Yacht Race. Also on that first race was a young New Zealander taking his first steps to becoming one of the sport's greatest icons. Peter Blake sailed on Burton Cutter, but it was a hand-to-mouth existence for the crew, who as soon as they arrived in port were hard at work refitting the boat. Despite the frustration of sailing with few resources, Blake had a taste for the race.
Blake was determined to get round properly, and the second race included Auckland as a stopover. So that really interested Peter, and he went on Heath Condor with Robin Knox-Johnston.
We always had a pretty good relationship. I mean, it was a very practical relationship. And Peter, I'd always say, I mean, he wasn't the technical sailor you get in the Olympics. What he had was great leadership qualities, the ability to motivate people, and is a safe bloke to sail with.
The second Whitbread race in 1977 saw solo sailing pioneer Robin Knox-Johnston skippering Heath's Condor, a boat built especially for the race and regarded as the favourite. But there was also a little-known Dutch industrialist who people were beginning to talk about.
I read the book, Theirs is the Glory, J. Blythe. And I thought, well, after I read it, why do other people those things? Why don't I do them ever, you know? It was always work, work, work. I made a set of rules, and one of them no shouting, one of them was no swearing, and they were not allowed to complain about the food, those kind of things. But it worked out fine.
This person was an unknown. He wasn't really rated very highly by us. We were thinking, oh, Robin Knox-Johnston, all this experience. But they were the first boat into Cape Town, and suddenly we all had to look up and say, blimey.
Heath's Condor had snapped their carbon fibre mast halfway through the first leg, all but destroying their chances of winning the race. They recovered well to win the second leg into Auckland, but it was only a temporary halt in Flyers' progress. Connie van Rietschoten maintained his overall lead through the rigours of the Southern Ocean and beyond. While some competitors' boats had barely been finished before the start, Flyer had sailed over 10,000 miles in training. Van Rietschoten's style could be authoritarian, but his professionalism changed the race from just a matter of survival at sea to genuine competition. His victory in Portsmouth was emphatic and deserved. The winner of the first Whitbread was an off-the-peg racer cruiser, but Van Rietschoten's victory had shown how important it was to build specifically for the race. Offshore sailing may have once been seen as purely a contest of human endurance, but as the status of the race grew, so too did the need to focus on every aspect of a title-challenging campaign.
I was the shore manager of a Flyer then, and I followed through with the building, the crew selection, and Connie did exactly the same planning as before. Now, the difference this time was that Peter Blake also did a huge amount of preparation.
They knew before it started that there was a big race between the two of them. They knew that was going to happen.
The 1981 Whitbread was only ever going to be about 2 men and 2 boats. The Netherlands' Connie van Rietschoten on Flyer and skippering Saramco New Zealand, Peter Blake. The Dutchman took first blood in the leg to South Africa, but Blake fought back from a dismasting to stay in the race. Battle had commenced. From the moment Van Rietschoten and Blake left Cape Town and headed south towards the icebergs and towering waves of the Southern Ocean, it was offshore racing at its fiercest. For the first time, the two skippers were sailing as fast at night as they did in the day. Something had to give.
Connie had a heart attack, Julian Fuller, our doctor, he just completed his training and he wanted to speak to the Ceramco. They were the nearest crew, but not only that, they had a cardiologist on board. He wanted to get advice. Connie said, absolutely no way. And he said, if the Ceramco crew know that I've got a problem, they're going to push even harder. I'm not going to let them know that.
The first thing that the guys on Ceramco, my boat, were to know if Connie had died was if they had to put him over the side and we saw him float past. He wanted to win.
Van Rietschoten recovered from his heart attack and refused to miss a mile of the race he had dedicated his life to winning. With a multinational crew dominated by Dutch and New Zealanders, Flyer was pushed all the way by Peter Blake. But it was Van Rietschoten who sailed into Portsmouth first to complete an historic double of race victories and in a world record time for a circumnavigation of the globe. To those who weren't part of the sailing world, the sport had often been seen as the preserve of the titled elite, more about wearing the right tie and cocktails with the Commodore than a love of the sea. The Whitbread had blown apart this image, with characters such as Van Rietschoten and Blake epitomizing a more heroic age. Self-made men who did battle with each other and the elements. It was 1985. The amateur adventurer was giving way to the professional ocean racer, and in their wake came the corporate sponsors and the celebrities.
Simon Le Bon and Drum brought a whole new dimension to the race. Here was a pop star, a well-known name right across the world, coming and doing the race.
I thought it was a high-risk situation in the beginning when I first heard about it, especially when I met Simon for the first time. His rock star get-up, but it all transpired to be very enjoyable indeed. He was a very intellectual sort of guy, and when he was with the crew on the sailboat, he really was a different person, I think, and I think he really enjoyed that a lot.
While Switzerland's Pierre Fellman was tasting the champagne after winning the first leg of the 1985 race, there were the usual stories of carnage, inevitable when untried designs faced weeks of offshore racing for the first time. And for those who did make it through, they knew worse was to come.
We said in Cape Town, we don't think Drum is safe to go in the Southern Ocean. So the crew said, well, we're not going there if not the designer of the boat is coming. So our skipper called up the designer of the boat, who was Ron Holland, and he said, no way I'm going, but I can send my brother. And we said, well, okay, he's sending his brother, then it's probably okay.
The round the world race is a very punishing race, and it punishes the equipment pretty much the most, I think. I think that people tend to, people are strong in comparison to the equipment they use.
In the early days of the Whitbread, families were waved off at the dock, not to be seen until the fleet returned many months later. Not so Peter Blake. Along with wife Pippa and daughter Sarah Jane, they sailed Lion from New Zealand to Portsmouth for the start, and it was Blake's family that provided the support he needed to take on the stresses of the race.
I just went down to the local sailing club one evening. I was down from London, and in walked this tall, blonde, mustachioed, handsome Kiwi, and I'd never met an Antipodean before. And I guess you could say the rest is history, because that was love at first sight, and that was it.
The majority of the 300,000 spectators who saw the fleet off from Auckland were firmly in the Blake camp. But as the boats headed back to the Southern Ocean, it was Fellman's UBS who were in front. Rounding the Horn was a rite of passage for sailors in the Clipper era, and a century later, it was no less significant.
At the Horn, we offered Neptune a toast in the traditional way. And after weeks of eating freeze-dried food and total alcoholic abstinence, one glass of this stuff and you're seeing things.
Fellman's Swiss team took the win into Uruguay, but it was Duran Duran singer Simon Le Bon who was putting the race on the front pages.
We've had big waves, we've had little waves, we've had a lot of wind, we've had no wind, we've had whales, we've had dolphins. This is a fantastic day in my life.
Fellman's UBS was to lead the fleet into the finish in Portsmouth, Blake again coming up short in a boat that had sacrificed speed for strength. 4 days later, it was Lionel Pion from France and his crew on board l'Esprit d'Equipe who took the overall victory and the trophy from Princess Diana. Offshore sailing was traditionally the preserve of men. Claire Francis had skippered ADC Accutrack in the 1977 race, but with a predominantly male crew. With few exceptions, female participation was at best marginal. But in 1989, one woman pushed for change, putting together the first all-female team in the race. Tracy Edwards had sailed in the last Whitbread as a cook, but this time she was the skipper.
It wasn't just a, oh no, you can't do it, don't be so silly. It was quite an aggressive backlash.
An all-women crew in an aluminium boat I described rudely as a tinful of tarts.
No one of us believed that she would get to finish the first leg, let alone get round the world.
Out on the water was extraordinary with all the boats coming out, and of course, you know, the big Navy ship for the start, and Duchess of York on the radio.
Hi Tracy, I just want to tell my girls that they better win. Right, yes we will, no problem.
The build-up was extraordinary. It really wasn't until sort of 2 days out when the land had disappeared and the other boats had disappeared, and there we were on our own, sort of looking around at each other going, blimey. Then we realised we were there and it was real.
On his fifth attempt, it seemed Peter Blake had finally got everything right with Steinlager 2. They stormed into Punta del Este in the first leg, while fellow Kiwi Grant Dalton's Fisher and Paykel limped after them with mast damage. The next leg to Fremantle plunged the fleet into the Southern Ocean, where conditions were as rough as anyone had seen, and for the first time since the inaugural race, a life was tragically lost at sea. But it wasn't Steinlager 2 who grabbed the headlines with another leg victory in Fremantle, but Tracy Edwards and her maiden crew with a stunning class win.
Bob and I were probably far too chauvinistic about it. We couldn't believe it, and they really showed us.
The other phrase that Bob Fisher coined was not just smart tarts, but smart, fast tarts, which we loved. And of course he got into a huge amount of trouble for.
If winning the Whitbread was the crowning glory, finishing first into Auckland was a close second for the two Kiwi frontrunners. Neck and neck they chased each other across 3,000 miles of ocean, until within sight of Auckland there was barely a mile between them.
It was intense, and it was so important that the Steinlager guys were going to get me first over the line, and obviously so important for Dawes.
One of those little cells of intense wind came down, and Fisher and Paykel went into a wild broach, and that gave Blake the opportunity to get the spinnaker down before anything happened and be in full control and be able to sail past them.
You didn't know quite, I mean, when the racing was that close, who was going to be first, so butterflies in the stomach.
Emboldened by a third successive win, Steinlager 2 never looked back. After a formidable crossing of the Southern Ocean, they were first into Punta del Este, first into Fort Lauderdale, and finally, just Southampton lay before them. Pushed every step of the way by a tenacious Grant Dalton on Fisher and Paykel, Steinlager completed the clean sweep as they took the last leg victory. Finally then, on his fifth attempt, Peter Blake had achieved what he had dedicated his whole sailing life to, winning the Whitbread.
It was a wonderful triumph. To win every leg needed not only skill and determination, but just that extra little bit of luck, perhaps.
I've climbed one Everest, yeah. There's a few more around that need to be looked at, so I'm not just going to sort of disappear, you know, into the background somewhere. I've got a few other things I intend to do.
He knew then that he wouldn't do another Whitbread race because there would be no point. I mean, he'd won every leg. It was almost like I don't have to do that again. But yeah, let's think of the next adventure.
A world record for the fastest non-stop lap of the globe with his old skipper Robin Knox Johnston, and 2 America's Cup victories followed for Blake. But it was his pioneering environmental work in highlighting the effect man was having on the world around him that was perhaps the most personally rewarding. But while traveling back along the Amazon, he was tragically murdered by gunmen. He was 53.
He was the ultimate family man, which you wouldn't necessarily think. I mean, he probably changed far more nappies than I ever did, but he was this great sort of tall, strong Kiwi, but he loved his family and they loved him.
In the world of offshore racing, biggest had been best, with the heavyweight maxi class dominating the whipbread for years. But these boats demanded a huge logistical effort to race, needed big crews to sail them fast, and their spiraling costs were in danger of putting off sponsors. So in 1993, a challenger was unveiled.
These whipbread 60s were fast, so the maxi guys were really uptight, that they could be beaten boat for boat.
The whipbread became a two-tier event. The maxi class attracted 4 entries like the Ketch New Zealand Endeavour, skippered by Grant Dalton, and the whipbread 60 class proved its popularity with 10 entries on the start line in Southampton. Dalton, though, was adamant he had chosen the best boat to win the race this time.
He really is one of the toughest guys I've ever met.
Back when I first started, which was just a delivery between parties, it used to be a race for misfit adventurers, you know, and we brought a whole new kind of level to it and just cleaned it up for years.
Dalton stamped his mark on the race from the start, as New Zealand Endeavour won the first leg into Punta del Este. But if Dalton had hoped the Southern Ocean would prove too tough for the fledgling whipbread 60 class, he was to be disappointed, as they carved their way to Australia in the second leg, taking the first 4 places and leaving the maxis wallowing in their wake. Dalton, though, kept the hammer down and the pressure on as the race headed for home. New Zealand Endeavour took the maxi win and the title of fastest boat around the world. Dalton had won the battle against the new 60s, but the war of words had just begun.
It's unfortunate that Grant is still on this thing, pushing the old wheelbarrow down the garden path. You know, he spent 3 years trying to make us slower so that he would win, and he's won. He should be very happy with the result, and we're ecstatic about it. And good on Grant for coming in here. He's won the maxis and we won the 60s. But they're not happy boys at all, and you know, they made bad calls. They bought 60s to be first around the world and they weren't, so tough luck to them, they got it wrong.
But 2 years later, Dalton himself was supervising the build of his own 60-footer, as the maxis finally bowed out. The whipbread became at last a race between boats all built to the same rule. By 1997, the Corinthian spirit had been replaced by a cool professionalism, as a new breed took on the race for the first time, and few epitomized the mood more than Paul Cayard.
We just were very inexperienced. We had 9 people like myself who were America's Cup sailors or star sailors on the boat, but we had our own style. When that all clicked and came together, yeah, I won't ever forget that.
We had a fresh approach. You know, we just upped the game at every level. Clothes, food, stacking, every level, we just pushed it harder.
He come from an Olympic background where you race around short courses just a mile long, where every centimetre and millimetre counts. He took that same level of obsession and applied it to 30,000 miles of racing around the world.
As the dot-com revolution took hold, the race was followed like never before. Millions around the world took to their computers to check the latest updated positions, living every mile of the race. Dalton had the experience, but it was Cayard's bunch of inshore racers on EF Language who had the edge on that first leg, beating the Kiwi into Cape Town by almost a day. Cayard seemed like the real deal, but there was much to learn.
We sailed out of Cape Town in good shape, made an early tactical mistake and were on the back foot. Cayard pressed really, really hard to catch up, and he pressed way too hard. They broke just about virtually every spinnaker on the boat. It was just a complete horror story.
And I was unconscious of the fact that there was something such as lifting your foot off the throttle or slowing down.
They got into Fremantle, and I remember meeting them there, and there was a very, very subdued atmosphere, and there was clearly a lot of tension on the boat.
For me personally, I get a really bad taste in my mouth when I'm in the lead in something and start backing down.
when we got in, and had a big meeting and actually changed the whole program at that point. And that's where Paul is actually pretty strong as a leader and said, all right guys, here's where I messed up, here's where you messed up, here's where you messed up, this is what we didn't do right, and here's how we're going to fix it. Any comments?
Pre-race, a lot of the smart money had been on Britain's Silk Cut. Rumoured to be the best-funded campaign, it was led by the mercurial Laurie Smith, sailing in his 4th Whitbread. A year earlier, Smith had been unveiled as EF Language's star skipper.
It's finalized and Laurie is here, and we are happy that we can work forward instead of backwards as it has felt over the last 2 months.
But 3 months later, Smith had jumped ship along with most of his crew and headed back home to front Silk Cut's high-profile entry. With money to spend, it seemed like a dream move.
Laurie Smith really had everything at his disposal when he had Silk Cut backing, a smoker with backing from a cigarette company, which we don't see anymore. He had everything going for him, but I don't think he spent it in the right areas. They weren't as well resourced in terms of shore crew, so when they came ashore after each leg, it was the sailors that were having to put the boat back together again, while on some of the other teams, those sailors were off to their hotels and getting much needed rest and recuperation before the next leg, so maybe cutting some corners here and there, and it started to tell, and it ended up with a broken mast.
Silk Cut's dismasting on the leg to Brazil put any chance of overall victory well beyond their reach. A new 24-hour distance record showed their boat was quick, but a series of lackluster finishes left many wondering where it had all gone wrong. As the rest of the fleet ploughed northwards on the long ride back to Southampton, Kayard and EF Language tightened their grip on the race lead. The Whitbread had been a 9-leg marathon, visiting more ports than ever before, and with it, Paul Kayard had taken communication to a new level, sharing his victorious lap of the planet with a legion of new fans.
My vision of this race was it was a tough race. I was coming into an environment that I didn't know too well, the offshore sailing, and I thought we would struggle at first, but that in the end we would grind it out. You know, when I went around the world in 97, 98, that was a voyage. It was a lot more than just the race. That was a lifetime experience to sail around the planet on the vehicle that I have spent my whole life on, a sailboat.
And my Mount Everest in life was to win this race. And of course, when you succeeded, all the emotion came out. It was fantastic. I don't regret a minute that I have spent all this time in sailing.
The Southern Ocean, perhaps more than any other area of the world, symbolizes what the Whitbread, or Volvo ocean race as it became, is all about. Ice, snow, towering waves, and winds that blow relentlessly and unstoppably around the bottom of the world. Nowhere on the planet is man more isolated from his fellow human beings.
Southern Ocean's for only a certain few, I think. It's the most beautiful place in the world. Some days, other days it's just, could be the worst place in the world.
If sailing's what you do, the greatest place in the world to go sailing is the Southern Ocean, because it's like your best ride at Disneyland and it just goes on. But then there's the big problem, because it just goes on and you can't get off the roller coaster.
One of the worst moments is when there is growlers, small icebergs around you, and you cannot see them on the radar. And you're completely in the darkness and the boat is doing all this speed. And you feel a little bit crazy then. You feel a little bit, wow, this is on the edge.
In 2001, the Volvo Ocean Race fleet went further south than ever before as the team sought every advantage over their rivals. For all the advances in technology, the boats were no less vulnerable to the hidden dangers that lurked beneath the waters of the Southern Ocean.
It's blowing 35 knots, you're doing 25 knots of boat speed, and you're hanging on the wheel. The navigator sticks his head up the hatch and he'll say, iceberg on the bow. And you go, how far? 1 mile. It's like 3 minutes you're on top of it. You have to react instantaneously. Once you get the call, iceberg, you react. And you basically drive through this pack ice, picking out the big bits to miss. And all the time you're doing 25 knots, the hammer's down fully, you're just going. And you just think, if we hit something bigger than 6 or 8 feet across, we will actually compromise the hull and go down. You go down below and you take your gloves off and your feet are frozen and your hands are frozen and you curl up in your bunk and you just pretend you're not there. And I don't need to do that anymore. That's my last thought.
The German-sponsored Ilbruck team, skippered by John Kostecki, was the class act of the race. They had out-prepared, outspent and outperformed their rivals from the time they announced their entry in the Volvo Ocean Race, newly acquired from Whitbread. Grant Dalton's AMA Sports 1 team was late in the water, and from the start Dalton had everything thrown at him. Gear failure, shredded sails, critically ill crew members. If he wanted a challenge, he'd got one on his 6th race around the world.
Man, that was a bit of fun.
Grant Dalton may not have had the fastest boat in that race, and he probably wasn't ever going to win it. But I just think it's his sheer bloody mindedness and determination that he's not easily fazed by things. So even if he knew he was sailing a slow boat, he would have taken it to the nth degree.
We've got to get on our game, and we'll do whatever's necessary to do that. And I'm brutally ruthless to make sure this campaign stays on the podium.
Dalton's pursuit of leaders Ilbruck was relentless, but the German-backed team were uncatchable by the time they came within sight of the finishing keel. They may have lacked the charisma of Kayard's EF, but the emotion was just as genuine.
I have an Olympic medal, but for sure, this is the best, top.
Dalton's determination to get on the podium meant his attention was diverted away from all-female AMA Sports 2, and the small matter of a wager to settle.
Grant said that if he was ever beaten by the girls, then he would stick a pineapple where the sun don't shine. And anyway, in the final leg into keel, the very final bit of the race, the girls indeed did beat Grant.
What a champ.
Fantastic.
Yeah, well done. Couldn't catch it. I hate to say.
He didn't quite oblige, but he did at least stick the pineapple down his underpants, which must have hurt a little bit. But I think what hurt him more was the fact that he was beaten by the girls.
This thing is way more potent and way faster. This thing's a weapon.
The Volvo 70 was the replacement for the aging 60-footer. It was a revolution in design, a canting or swinging keel, 60% more sail area, but 2 tons lighter with a crew of just 10. New territory for both designers and sailors alike. The Far Office, designers of the previous 4 race winners, were the favoured choice in 2005. But ABN AMRO were a 2-boat team with a secret weapon, 34-year-old Argentinian designer Juan Cuyumjan.
I'll be honest, I wanted the fastest boat in the fleet. Not only did we have a fantastic association with Juan, we made him overanalyze everything to death because we couldn't just sit back and say, hey, the Far Office have won every race. It's going to be right this time as well.
JK just hit it first time, bang on with the Volvo Open 70. He got the right area of the rule, the wide, fat stern and the twin rudders. That was the key insight.
The Far boats had dominated the import race a week before the start of the main event, with ABN AMRO's 2 racers bringing up the rear. It was starting to look like ABN's gamble had already backfired. But the light winds of the import race were a world away from what the fleet could expect on that first leg from Vigo, Spain. As they plunged south into a raging Atlantic, the new 70s were about to be tested for the first time. As the crews on the Far boats wrestled to keep their charges together, it was ABN AMRO 1, the broad but bulletproof racer, which was already beginning to run away with the race.
The great challenge in that race was knowing how hard to push without breaking the legs off your boat. That wasn't really an issue that they ever had with the VO60. That was just pedal to the metal, drive it as hard as you can. If you do that with the VO70, it will break.
When I went down below that first night and saw the water pressure on the top of the keel box, it was just extremely apparent to me that there was no way that boat was going to sail 7,000 miles in that state. So we sailed it as gingerly as we could back towards Portugal,
So the first night of the whole race threw everything that this race has had to throw at us.
ABN AMRO 1 continued its path to victory in Cape Town. Their domination of the race became a full-scale rout as they won 5 of the first 6 legs. Meanwhile, the FAR office was deep into full-scale crisis management as leg after leg teams retired with technical issues, often down to the hydraulics associated with the new canting keels. ABN's progress had been serene by comparison, and a triumphant homecoming in Europe was just a transatlantic crossing away.
I think a lot of people assume that it's the sort of remoteness of the Southern Ocean which is where all the problems occur in races. In fact, very often it's the North Atlantic where you experience the most problems, and as we saw in the worst possible way in the 2005-6 race.
The stage from New York to Portsmouth was as hard a leg as any the fleet had sailed so far. Freezing temperatures and winds building to over 50 knots. At 2 in the morning on May 18th, ABN AMRO 2, sister ship to the race leader, experienced a sudden jump in wind speeds. As the boat buried itself into a wave, 32-year-old Hans Horowitz was swept from the deck.
The most sickening feeling you can ever have as an offshore sailor, to know one of your teammates is in the sea.
As the crew on ABN 2 began a desperate search for Horowitz, the rest of the Volvo fleet was deep in the same low-pressure system.
On May 18th and May 19th, the wind came up. It was blowing 35 to 40, which isn't more wind really than we saw at Cape Horn, but the Atlantic waves are very, very steep. And the amount of water was coming over the deck and sloshing people around and knocking them down. And normally we would take the spinnaker down at night just to be safe, but at one point on May 19th, we took the spinnaker down in the middle of the day and put the jib up. It was just that rough. So yeah, I've been scared.
After searching for 40 minutes, the crew of ABN 2 located Horowitz, unconscious, in the water.
Amazingly, they did recover him, but when they got him on board, they were unable to resuscitate him. And that was an absolutely devastating blow to the race.
The fact that it was, getting on for 20 years since the previous death in the race, maybe people had forgotten what this race is really all about, because in the first 20 years of the Whitbread race, there were a lot of deaths, and it is a dangerous sport, and that was a nasty reminder of it.
2 days after the tragic loss on ABN 2, the race was again plunged into a nightmare scenario. 300 miles from the English coast, Movistar launched off a wave. The resulting impact compromised the hull. Sinking and too far offshore for rescue, the closest boat to them, ABN AMRO 2.
It was one of those times where you're left with a choice to either cut your losses and get off safely, or if you can persevere in that storm. And you know, there was a lot of risk involved to have stayed with it. So the decision was made to abandon ship, get in a life raft and get picked up by ABN 2.
Such had been the drama of the previous days that few realised ABN AMRO 1 would become Volvo champions with 2 legs to spare if they were first to Portsmouth. While all around them had been breakages and crew changes, Mike Sanderson had brought his boat and the same 9 sailors all the way with him. At 34, he was the youngest skipper to win the race.
It's such a special moment. This is my Olympic medal. This is my climbing of Mount Everest. This is my childhood dream, to get to skipper a boat and win it in the Volvo Ocean Race.
The boats would be the same for the next race, but the route would be radically different. Instead of the usual dive south to Australia, the fleet would head east to India, Singapore and China before taking on a mammoth 12,300-mile journey through the Southern Ocean to Rio. The commercial sponsors were ecstatic as the race opened up new markets like never before.
If you go to yacht races around the world, it's often the places where they've never experienced sailing where they get the biggest turnouts.
Places like India and China. So an eye-opener for the sailors and for everyone involved in the race.
With the prospect of reaching untapped markets like never before, the race attracted one of the most international fleets in years. Ericsson had recruited the core of ABN's winning team, signing Juan Cuyumjan as their designer, and for their skipper, one of the most successful sailors in Olympic history, Torben Grael. Grael had skippered Brazil's first ever entry to a creditable third place, but this time he was on a boat that looked to have won the race before it had even started.
He's one of the fastest drivers of a boat, so when he's got his hands on the wheel, there are a few people that can match him. He understands the wind pretty much better than anyone else, and he's won 5 Olympic medals to prove that. He just sees things that other people don't see.
The boats in the very first race were as different from the Volvo Open 70 Grael was piloting as a biplane is from a stealth fighter. Since those early years, life above and below decks had changed dramatically. Alcohol disappeared long ago, food was freeze-dried, and living conditions cramped, cheerless, and filled with a deafening sound of creaking carbon. At times, sailing in the Volvo resembles nothing short of a sadistic social experiment.
The fact that you're living with people all the time, you see guys come to blows on the training pitch in football, and they get to go home to the wife every night and have a bitch about the blokes they're playing with. You don't have that opportunity when you're on a sailboat.
Run her off! Run her off! Jesus Christ!
It's really brutal on relationships and just how a small group of people work together effectively without tearing each other's heads off. I think the Volvo Ocean Race tests you in so many different ways, and probably the mental side is the hardest of all.
The pressure on the modern race skipper has grown immeasurably since the first race. With budgets now in the multi-millions, the need for a team to deliver results has never been greater. Ericsson 4 looked on top of their game as the fleet reached Singapore, with victory in 2 of the first 3 legs and a new 24-hour distance record. But their failure to inform officials of a change to their bow suddenly put the future of their whole campaign in jeopardy. And it was Torben Grael who was in the firing line.
I can hold the pressure of being the tactician of an Italian America's Cup team in 2 Louis Vuitton finals, and I can hold the pressure of sailing 6 Olympic Games. And I can hold the pressure of sailing 600 miles in 24 hours. But I cannot hold the pressure of this.
Most of us who were neutral outsiders felt that it would have been a great shame to have taken points away from what was clearly the class act in the fleet. The result of the race could have been different, and I think it was a very stressful time for those guys.
Grael and Ericsson 4 avoided a points penalty and resumed their place atop the leaderboard. While some skippers like to drive from the front, others see themselves as first among equals. One of the boys. Magnus Olsen sailed his first Whitbread in 1985 on Simon Le Bon's drum. In 1998, he finally achieved his dream, winning the race on Kayard's EF language. The Swede was in demand for both his experience and his unique sense of humor.
This is the last time I step off a boat in a leg in the Volvo Ocean Race, and I'm happy with that.
But 6 years later, he was back, sailing with Ericsson 3, the Nordic entry in their 2-boat campaign.
The addiction is this adrenaline level that you feel good about, and it's very high throughout the whole race, and you feel very good, and you want that again, and you want that again, and again, and again. That's crazy.
Magnus is always smiling. I mean, there just seems so many reasons when you're out there doing a Volvo Ocean Race not to be smiling. But he's always having a laugh.
We are so happy for second place. Second.
But even Olsen was tested when he took over as skipper on the leg from Singapore to Qingdao, China. Hull damage meant a diversion to Taiwan, and then 7 hours after the rest of the fleet had left China, they were on the longest leg in race history, 12,300 miles to Brazil, with the oldest skipper in the race, 60-year-old Magnus Olsen.
Historically, the strategy in the Southern Ocean has always been to just head south, wait till it's blowing 40 knots, then turn left and head east. Their navigator, Axel Magdal, was proposing something completely different.
They saw something that the meteorology information was saying that there's a good call here, boys, let's go for it. and they did it. They jibed away from the fleet, and it paid off big time.
Now, the other navigators had all seen it, and many of them had thought about it. No one had the nerve. And so Axel Magdahl and Magnus Olsson, they tacked, went northeast, and 2 days later they had a one-day lead. It was a truly spectacular maneuver.
After nearly 6 weeks at sea and running low on food, Olsson and his crew headed into Rio as winners, and with Magnus Olsson as the oldest skipper to win a leg in race history.
To come in as winner on the longest leg at the most heroic possible fashion, really, with a huge lead, was just amazing. And some people would have responded to that in quite a calm way. Magnus just let it all hang out, and you knew he was so happy.
Ericsson 4 was second into Rio, and winning 3 of the last 5 legs took overall victory. The race had taken sailing to places where the sport had been unknown, and the reception it received showed that even in uncertain economic times, or perhaps especially in such times, the heroism of raw human endeavor was still a compelling story that people were hungry to hear. Since that first Whitbread race in 1973, much may have changed. The adventurer has given way to the athlete. Technology has made it a war of speed, not just survival. And every mile sailed can be shared with millions around the world. But one thing above all others has remained constant.
It's like a drug. This race becomes something you can't live without. It's extraordinary.